What's going on, people? It's your boy Quantum Kai, and I'm back with another interesting video. Today's video is a lecture with Zeinab Badawi, an Oxford graduate that went on to become a TV and radio journalist and a presenter of an amazing show, History with Africa. In this lecture, Zeinab talks on the importance of African history and African world influence. She does a good job reminding us of the effects of colonialism on the education that we receive in our educational institutions and the effects it can have on us and our psychological development as black descendants from Africa. I couldn't agree more with the points that Zeinab makes in this lecture. And the person with no knowledge of history is equal to like a tree with no roots. In 2023, we should be ashamed of lacking knowledge of ourselves, lacking knowledge of our ancestors and our motherland. So yeah, let's jump into the video. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it really inspires you to start educating yourself about yourself and your culture and your history and the history of Africa. So yeah, let's dive in.
So, I grew up with women who, if they were alive today, would be well over 100 highly educated women with degrees from Western universities. My mother was a teacher, and so on and so forth. So I grew up with very, very powerful female figures where it was just, we imbibed it with our mother's milk, really. But having said that, I was sitting down a few years ago with my late father, who died last year very sadly, and my mother, and I said, these are two people who are highly educated, in the Sudan. And I said, what do you know about Sudan's ancient history? And I said, well, we were taken to the pyramids once on a school trip in the 1930s or the 1940s, and these were people who could tell you about British history, kings, King Henry VIII, his wives, and so on. And yet, when it came to their own country's history, these two educated people, drew a bit of a blank. And it wasn't just my parents. I realized this, over time, that I was filming in Lagos in Nigeria, and I was going around the university there, and I talked to the finest, the brightest and the best of Nigeria, and I said, what do you know about your history? And they said, well, we got our, Nigeria was formed in 1911, slavery obviously was quite, thing. And I said, well, before that, and they all drew a blank. And I realized that actually this was a pattern, not only in Africa, across generations, but also diaspora African communities who, perhaps living in the Caribbean or whatever, were feeling quite deracinated, didn't know so much about their history. And I thought, this isn't right. And I began to think about myself. What do I know about my own history? And when I realized that although I've always liked to say, I'm a well-educated person, what did I know? And it reminded me of a time when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, who was one of the history professors when I was actually there, Professor Hugh Trevor Roper, late Hugh Trevor Roper. And this is what he said about African history. Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. He talked about the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. So, if you think that kind of infantilization of a continent, and I actually think that Africans have been infantilized to a degree which we have not seen with people anywhere else in the world, if you think that's just, the ruminations of a man long since dead, no, the leader of a major Western country only a few years ago, less than a decade ago, was visiting an African country, a key African country, made a speech to his African audience. They all listened very politely as he said, the African people have not entered the history books. They've not entered history. And when I visited this particular country not so long ago, to this day, so many people from, presidents, politicians down to waiters in restaurants remembered this speech made by this Western leader that the African man had not entered history. So don't think this is something that you can consign to the past. So it was with these thoughts that I began to develop an interest in ancient Sudan. And, I discovered wonderful things. There are 1,000 pyramids in the Sudan. 300 of them preserve their superstructure. In the 8th century BC, the kings of ancient Sudan, the kings of Kush were superpowers in Africa. Their influence extended as far as the modern-day Middle East. They governed Egypt for the best part of a century, and so on and so forth. And then after that, so with all this sort of coalescing in my mind, my metamorphosis was sort of quite gradual. The conversation with the parents, the finding out about ancient Sudan. I then was at UNESCO, and I saw there that there were some volumes called The General History of Africa. And I asked what these were, the GHA. And I was told that in the early 1960s, during that period of rapid decolonization in Africa, the newly independent African president said, look, we have decolonized our countries, we want to decolonize our history. So they got together. There was a very enlightened Frenchman, René Maillot, who was Director General of UNESCO at the time, and he said, okay, Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Nyerere, and so on and so forth, you guys pay for this and I'll facilitate this process. So UNESCO scoured the continent of Africa for the best historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, paleontologists, you name it. And they compiled volume after volume after volume of Africa's history written by Africans themselves. There's a difference between being an Africanist and an African historian. These were African historians. And these are proper scholarly works, They use the kind of sources which Western historians had often overlooked, and they also use, use culture like music, dance, and so on to inform what they had done. And they said, just because Western historians have said in the past that Africa's history is not always recorded, written, it doesn't mean that Africans don't have a history. Indeed, they have the longest history in the world because it's where human beings originated. If you're not from Africa, you're an African export, aren't you? So, when we're talking about trade, Africa was the major exporter par excellence. So, so the irony that this continent with this long history should be told that, well, you don't really have a history because, it just means you've got to get at it in a different way. And that's what the African historians did. So I thought this is a wonderful, inspiring project, but very few people know about it. So I then worked out with UNESCO how I could make a TV history series based on these volumes, Africa's history, told by Africans themselves, the experts, but I also wanted to make sure that ordinary African citizens were also part of this conversation. And I embarked on this journey of filming around Africa the first history series of what was called The History of Africa with Zeinab Badawi, which went out on BBC World TV. And it was a real eye-opener for me, going around seeing the wonderful things that just at the back of my mind proved Hugh Trevor Roper so wrong. We all know about ancient Egypt, but what about the Kingdom of Axum in modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea and bits of the Horn of Africa? In the 4th century, this was described by a Greek historian as one of the 4 greatest civilizations of the world. What about Great Zimbabwe, the wonderful, monuments, if you go there? What about King Musa in the 12th, 13th century, who, was one of the kings of the Mali Empire, the Ghana Empire, the Nok civilization, that was BCE, before a common era in Nigeria today, in northern Nigeria. Really, honestly, I could go on and on. The Berber kingdoms of North Africa with their head, their capital in Morocco. It was just, there was so much history that actually my first series stops at around the 13th century, and I've got to start the second series. So really, there is so much there that you can get at. And why I think history is so important is, I'll give you a quote from the late, wonderful Kenyan environmental and social activist Wangari Maathai, who sadly died in 2011, but she received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. And she said, "You cannot enslave a mind that knows itself, that values itself, that understands itself." And I'm very heartened that, just as the African leaders in the 1960s, with this project, which is still ongoing, by the way, the General History of Africa, at UNESCO, just as they said, look, we've got to reclaim our history. Now you see, for example, students in South Africa wanting to decolonize their curriculum, because even 20 years after the end of apartheid, more than 20 years, you still find that, higher education in South Africa is still deeply rooted in colonial and apartheid thinking. You see students now at Oxford University saying we want African history to be taught because it's part of world history. African history is part of the global narrative. It's not just something that's just relevant to you if you are of African origin. It is absolutely for everybody. So this is what I'm very keen to be part of, is reconstructing African history from an African perspective, putting the African intelligentsia center stage. So I'm not saying do away. I'm not saying, and honestly, there are so many of them. I mean, in this series, every person I interviewed was, an African. And the minds, they would be comfortable in any major academic institution anywhere in the world. It's just they've not been given the chance to go centre stage. Put them centre stage. Great thinkers like Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, the late Senegalese professor. Yes, he should be known. He was a polymath, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, accomplished in so many disciplines. People should know about him. So, I really want to be part of this movement.